Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start with the Namo Tassa as usual. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's class. I see that Anagalika Sunya has said that she is in COVID isolation, so I hope that you're doing well and that you will recover soon. And I hope that the symptoms are not too bad. So let's see if by hearing some Dhamma you'll feel a little better. As you know, there are some suttas in the Pali Canon where the Buddha or one of the senior disciples is sick and then they listen to some Dhamma teachings and afterwards they feel so happy that they recover from the illness. So hopefully, let's see if we can make you feel a little better this morning. So today we want to talk a little bit about the topic of fear. So I think fear is quite an important cause of suffering in the modern world, or maybe even in the Buddha's time, but especially in the modern world, where it seems that anxieties and phobias and traumas are very widespread. A lot of people suffer from social anxieties nowadays, especially after the pandemic. It seems that this has multiplied extremely. It seems that a lot of people have problems going out again, meeting people, connecting with other people. And people have a lot of problems or trouble getting together with others again after, just being able to connect with others online. So it seems that a lot of people have developed a lot of anxiety. And on top of that, obviously, in those uncertain times, there's a lot of fear. In general, there are wars, there are all these pandemics, people are afraid of losing their jobs, people are afraid of losing a loved one. And there are just so many causes for all sorts of fears that I thought it would be really good to talk a little bit about this and to see what the Buddha has to say about this. And I think it's quite interesting, this topic of fear, because obviously the Buddha also talked about this in some way. And especially the Buddha talked about old age, sickness, and death. So obviously these are all things that cause extreme anxiety in a lot of people. The fear of getting sick, the fear of pain, the fear of eventually dying or losing a loved one that is dying. So clearly this is one of the central points in the Buddha's teaching, but still in many of the central core teachings where the Buddha summarized various hindrances of the mind or various obstacles to practice, he didn't really include fear in that. So for example, when we look at the four evil roots, greed, hatred, and delusion, there's obviously greed, there's hatred, and there's delusion, but fear isn't really there. Or when we look at the 5 hindrances, there are obviously sensual desire, there's ill will, there's laziness, there is restlessness, and there's doubt. And again, we see in these 5 hindrances, which is such a central topic for classifying defilements in our mind, again, we don't see that fear is there. And so obviously people say, well, fear is included under ill will, or fear is included under restlessness, or fear is included here and there, but fear isn't explicitly mentioned, even though it's such a core central cause of suffering for many people. So I thought today we're going to have a look at one of the suttas that specifically deals with fear and how the Buddha dealt with fear while he was still practicing. So today we are going to have a look at the Bhayabherava Sutta. This is Majjhima Nikaya number 4. I have put a link in the live chat to Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, and I will also read from his translation. So let's have a look. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then the Brahmin Janusoni went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side and said, Master Gotama, when clansmen have gone forth from the home life into homelessness out of faith in Master Gotama, do they have Master Gotama for their leader, their helper, and their guide? And do these people follow the example of Master Gotama? That is so, Brahmin, that is so. When clansmen have gone forth from the home life into homelessness out of faith in me, they have me for their leader, their helper, and their guide, and these people follow my example. So here we have a Brahmin who is engaging the Buddha in a conversation. Obviously, the Brahmin probably wasn't Buddhist himself, but he seems to have been interested in the Buddha's way of training his disciples. So the first question that he asks here is, does the Buddha actually support his disciples, and do his disciples follow the Buddha's example? Or does the Buddha completely disregard his disciples, or does he teach the disciples, but they're not actually following his example, they're doing something else entirely? So this is also a question of whether the Buddha takes care of the people who have gone forth under him, and also a question if the people who have gone forth actually have faith in the Buddha, and if they actually do what the Buddha teaches them, and if they also actually practice the way that the Buddha has practiced. And of course, the Buddha says, yeah, they have faith. They have faith and they follow my example. And obviously, the Buddha also cares for his disciples, and he teaches them and he guides them in a positive way. So this is just a kind of general introduction. And then the Brahmin Janusoni comes to the actual topic that he wants to talk about. And so he says, but Master Gotama, remote jungle, thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure, seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungles must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. That is so, Brahmin, that is so. Remote jungle, thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure, seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungles must rob bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. So now the Brahmin comes to the question that he actually wants to ask, and he asks about people who are going into the jungle, into the forest, into seclusion, and isn't that very, very difficult to do? Isn't it really difficult to be alone in solitude? And wouldn't people be very, very fearful, and wouldn't they go crazy because they're so fearful when they're alone there in solitude, if they're not very well practiced, if they don't have deep samadhi stages? So if they have no concentration. And on some way, I think it's a very relatable question, because still nowadays it's very difficult for many people to be alone without feeling lonely. And when they feel lonely, they get depressed. And when they get depressed, obviously the mind is very unstable, and you can't really practice and develop deep stages of samadhi, because those require a mind that is uplifted and that is peaceful and calm, and also a mind that is happy and inspired. So in one sense, we can understand why the Brahmin is asking this. On the other hand, I think, for me personally, that's not really how I feel. I love being alone. For me, it's much more difficult to be around other people. And I think many people, especially people who have practiced the Dhamma for a while, they really enjoy being in a quiet place, being in solitude. And they don't like being in noisy places. So maybe it's not that easy to relate to this part of the sutta. But on the one hand, I think we have to understand that the way people practiced back then wasn't quite the way we practice now. Back then, wild places were a lot more wild than they are nowadays. Nowadays, we don't have those really remote areas where there's only jungle for many miles and miles and miles, and where there is no human habitation, and where there are lots of dangerous animals that are full of tigers and snakes and wild elephants and stuff like that, so that are really, really dangerous to be in. In modern times, we have basically almost killed all the wild animals, and especially the dangerous ones. So we don't have these kind of places anymore to go to. So on the one hand, we don't really have the same situation anymore that they had back then. And on the other hand, I think still it is very difficult for many people to go into solitude. So sometimes it can seem like this very romantic idea. You go to the forest, it's going to be quiet and peaceful, and you live in a nice cave, and everything's going to be so happy and blissful. But actually, when we do it, we'll feel quite bored very soon. Our mind starts to think about this and that. And many people who've been on longer retreats will notice that there is quite a long period, especially if you go into a solitary retreat where you really don't have contact with other people, where your mind becomes quite unstable, or can become quite unstable if you're not well practiced, and where you have all sorts of defilements coming up, and where it's really difficult to be alone and not to be around other people. And especially as human beings, we're social animals. A lot of our identity is also tied up with interaction with other people. So we like to be appreciated by others. We like to hear nice words from others. We like to socialize and spend a good time together. So it can be quite challenging also to go into solitude even nowadays. So I think even though we don't have quite the same situation as they had back then, still it can be quite challenging for many people to go into solitude. And also, obviously, I think especially when you go to other countries, especially Asian countries, for many people there, it is still a lot more challenging than it is for people who live in the West. Like when I spent time in Sri Lanka, for example, and I lived there in a forest kuti, and sometimes people came and stayed in our monastery, and there were people who had really hard time staying alone in the forest, and it was really challenging, really very, very difficult, very, very fearful experience. We even had people who didn't even last one night. As soon as the sun set and dusk came, they packed their stuff and they ran out of the monastery and went back to the city. So it is still a very, very kind of challenging practice to do for many people. So anyway, the Buddha agrees with the Brahmin that this can be very challenging, and if your mind is not very well practiced, then it can make the mind quite shaken and quite unstable. And so the Buddha continues, and he now tells the story of his own practice before his enlightenment. Before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, I too considered thus: remote jungle, thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure. Seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungles must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. I considered thus: whenever recluses or Brahmins, unpurified in bodily conduct, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, then, owing to the defect of their unpurified bodily conduct, these good recluses and Brahmins evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I do not resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest unpurified in bodily conduct. I am purified in bodily conduct. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones, with bodily conduct purified. Seeing in myself this purity of bodily conduct, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. And then the Buddha continues, I considered thus: whenever recluses or Brahmins, unpurified in verbal conduct, unpurified in mental conduct, or unpurified in livelihood, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, they evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I am purified in verbal conduct, mental conduct, and in livelihood. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones, with livelihood purified. Seeing in myself this purity of livelihood, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. So now the Buddha says that before his enlightenment, he also thought that if you go to these wild areas, these wildernesses in the forest, then that could be quite, that could like make your mind unstable. It could bring up a lot of fear if concentration is not strong. But then he said he reflected wisely about a few points, and now there's a whole list of points that he reflected on. And as he reflects on them, he notices that there are several causes for fear that he has already abandoned, and so it's less likely that he will actually encounter fear while he is in the wilderness. And so all these points that the Buddha brings up now are points that we can work with if we struggle with fear, and we can see which of these points are things that we can practice with and that we can still improve on in order so that the fear that we feel inside might diminish or eventually be abandoned. And so the first thing that the Buddha brings up is the bodily conduct, and then of course verbal and mental conduct and livelihood. So all of these are related to the practice of sila, ethical conduct. And of course, we all know that sila is the foundation for the Buddhist path. It's the foundation for meditation practice. And if our sila is not strong, if our sila is not good, then obviously our mind will be quite unstable, and that will lead to a lot of problems, and that will lead to a lot of defilements, and that will prevent us from actually developing deeper stages of samadhi. So of course, purified bodily conduct, that refers especially or mainly to the first 3 of the 5 precepts: not killing or harming other beings, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, and of course practicing the opposite. That would be even better, because that means we fill our mind with wholesome qualities, such as practicing compassion instead of killing or harming, such as practicing generosity instead of stealing, and such as being faithful to our partner and loving and caring to the people around us instead of committing sexual misconduct. And then for the verbal conduct, of course, we know the four kinds of unwholesome verbal conduct: lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and gossip. And we can also practice the opposites: speaking the truth, speaking in a way that unites people, that brings people together, speaking gently, and speaking about things that are worth talking about, that are worth discussing. And then, of course, the mental conduct, that refers to abandoning greed, hatred, and delusion in our mind. Of course, this is a process that will go on and on until we reach arahantship. So at this early stage, probably the Buddha didn't mean that we have to fully abandon this, but we have to aware what is going on in our mind, and we have to kind of have mindfulness of our thoughts and our emotions, and try to work with them and try to deal with them in a way that is as wholesome as possible. And then, of course, livelihood means that we don't earn our living by ways that are that break the precepts. So for lay people, that would mean that we can't earn our livelihood in any way that would harm other beings, or that would be deceitful, or that would involve fraud, or that would involve stealing from others, or that would involve causing problems for other beings in any way. For monastics, it's a lot more detailed, a lot more refined still. The way that we have to follow, the rules that we have to follow in order for our livelihood to be pure. So we have a whole long list of rules in our monastic code called the Patimokkha that we need to observe. So for monastics, it's a lot more detailed, but generally it means having a way of earning our money that is pure, that doesn't break the precepts, and that is open and clear, and that doesn't have to be hidden from other people, because it's wholesome and it's beneficial for us and for others. And so, of course, if we live in this way, then we can just be open. We don't have anything to hide. We don't have any dark secrets that we can't share with other people. And of course, in that, if we live in this way, we're not filled with remorse. we are not, we don't keep on thinking about the past and think, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and I wish I could change what I did back then. And we can just be like, whatever we do, we can just be happy with the way we act. And we can think back and be satisfied with our life and think about all the good deeds that we have done, the good karma that we have made, instead of thinking back and regretting what we have done. And of course, if we made a lot of bad karma, then we need to, like, we should be fearful, because that will lead to bad consequences. But if we made a lot of good karma, then we don't need to be fearful, because only good consequences will come from that. So that is one reason why if we have good sila, good ethical conduct, then when we go into the forest, we can find solace in the forest instead of finding all this fear and dread. And then the Buddha keeps on going with his list of various things that might evoke fear and dread that we can abandon in order to abandon fear. And so the next point that the Buddha brings up is the following. I considered thus, whenever recluses or Brahmins who are covetous and full of lust resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, and so on and so on, that will lead to fear and dread, but I am uncovetous. And so I find solace in the forest. So the next point is to do with covetousness, with lust. So this is obviously the first of the 5 hindrances. So now the Buddha actually goes through a list of the 5 hindrances. So the next one is recluses and Brahmins that have a mind of ill will and intentions of hate, but I have a mind of loving kindness. Recluses and Brahmins that are overcome by sloth and torpor, but I am without sloth and torpor. Recluses and Brahmins that are overcome with restlessness and unpeaceful in mind, and I have a peaceful mind. And recluses and Brahmins that are uncertain and doubting, and I have gone beyond doubt. So these are obviously the 5 hindrances. So if we have the 5 hindrances in our mind, that can lead to fear. If we have a mind full of lust, that can lead to fear, because we fear that we won't get what we are after, or that we will lose again what we are after. When we have a mind full of ill will, intentions of hate, that will lead to fear, because if we harm other beings, then in the future, the karma that we make will harm ourselves. If we have a lot of sloth and torpor, then that might lead to fear, because we are not clear in the mind, or we are not clear-headed. And if we are muddle-minded, then a lot of unwholesome thoughts can arise, and those thoughts can include fear and dread, obviously, because our mindfulness is not there to prevent all these unwholesome thoughts from coming up. The same with restlessness. Being unpeaceful in mind means there are a lot of chaotic thoughts in our mind, a lot of things going on. So again, our mindfulness will not be strong enough to prevent unwholesome fear and dread from coming up. And being uncertain and doubting can lead to fear, because if we are uncertain, then we don't know the proper way, we don't know how to practice the Buddhist Dhamma, we don't see a clear path for the future. And of course, in that case, we will have a lot of anxiety. We won't know what to do. We won't know what the future holds. We won't know how to actually practice in a way that will lead to the end of suffering. And so obviously, since the future is uncertain and we don't know how to properly move forward, that will lead to a lot of anxiety about the future. So these are the 5 hindrances. Obviously, this is again, abandoning them is again a long process. It's not something that we can just abandon easily. This takes a lot of practice, and if we have abandoned them, we are already on a very high stage on the path. So it's also a matter of like gradually diminishing those hindrances, and as they gradually diminish, the fear and dread that we experience in our life will also gradually diminish. And then the Buddha goes on to the next point on the list, and he says those recluses and Brahmins are given to self-praise and disparagement of others, And I am not given to self-praise and disparagement of others. So this again is a cause of fear, as all the points on this list. So somebody who likes to praise themselves, who thinks very highly of themselves, even though maybe they're not that great, and who put others down all the time. A lot of people have this habit of really having to put others down all the time so that they themselves will feel better. And that obviously creates a lot of ego, that creates a lot of attachments, and that leads to a lot of suffering. So if we think very, very highly of ourselves and put others down, obviously that will lead to others criticizing us and others disliking us. And as I mentioned before, human beings are social animals. We like to be liked by others. We want others to praise us. And if we have very big egos, then there's a lot of fear involved in that also. The bigger our ego, the bigger the fear that other people will not respect us, that other people will not like us. If we keep on praising ourselves, then we also need the praise of other people in order to maintain this illusion of being this really great person. But if other people keep on criticizing us, then basically our self-created ego illusion will sort of implode and will not be maintainable. And so we have a lot of fear that we will lose our own identity. And of course, this is a fake identity, not a real self there. But there's a lot of delusion tied up with that. And therefore, because we fear that other people will challenge our self-image that we have created, we have a lot of fear tied up with that also. So that's why self-praise and disparagement of others can lead to a lot of fear. And then the next point is, the Buddha says, those recluses and Brahmins who are given or who are subject to alarm and terror, but I am free from trepidation. So this seems to be somewhat like a circular argument. Like obviously alarm and terror seems like almost the same thing as fear. It's just maybe more like a more intense stage of fear. So obviously the Buddha says he is already free from trepidation. If you're already free from trepidation, which I think is also another word for being fearless, then obviously fear wouldn't come up again. So it seems like, it's a little bit circular. But I think what the Buddha means here, alarm and terror obviously is a more intense kind of fear. So the Buddha is no longer subject to these intense kind of fears because his livelihood is already purified, because he has already abandoned the 5 hindrances to some degree. So this intense kind of alarm and terror is no longer something that arises in his mind. But of course, for people who have these very intense feelings of terror, people maybe who have very intense phobias, people who have very intense traumas, of course, for such people, because their mind and their body is always on like a very high level of anxiety already, it's very easy to trigger very intense feelings of fear. Even the smallest triggers can trigger full-on panic attacks, full-on anxiety attacks. So for people who already live in this state of alarm and terror in their daily lives all the time, it's very easy to trigger fear and dread. But if you don't have these very intense feelings, if you don't have these like phobias, if you don't have these traumas and so on, then fear and dread won't be triggered that easily. So obviously having all these traumas is very, very painful. It's a lot of suffering. And eventually this is something that we also need to work with. We need to work on releasing these, letting them go, putting them down, so that we can actually enter into peaceful states of mind. Then the next point on the list is the Buddha talking about recluses and Brahmins who are desirous of gain, honor, and renown, but I have few wishes. So this is kind of similar to other things that were on the list already. The first point, people who desire gain. Gain means material things, so people who want to accumulate a lot of stuff. And especially because here in this case, we talk about recluses and Brahmins. Usually they wouldn't have money. So in order to get a lot of stuff, they rely on donations of others. So you have to please other people. You have to tell them what they want to hear instead of telling them what is actually the truth, maybe. Because if you tell them the truth, they will be displeased and they will not support you. So it's kind of a vicious circle. The same with honor and renown. Honor and renown obviously refer more to your reputation. You want to have a good reputation. You don't want to damage your reputation, so you want people to talk about you in a good way. So again, you have to tell them what they want to hear. You have to please them. And so there will be, since you need a lot of stuff, you need to have all these gain, and you want to maintain your good reputation. You're always anxious that you will not get the stuff that you want. You are always anxious that people will talk badly about you, that you will lose your reputation, that you will lose your renown. But if you actually have few wishes, if you don't need too many material things, and if you don't really care that much what other people say about you, then obviously this is one cause of fear that you don't have to worry about. And then the next point is those people who are lazy and wanting in energy. And the Buddha says, I am energetic. This is again similar to the hindrance that we talked about before, the hindrance of sloth and torpor. Just with a slightly different twist here, with the idea of being energetic, that if you're energetic, this helps you to overcome your fear. Because fear can be very paralyzing for many people. So for some people, if you have intense fear, that can give you a lot of energy, because you have a fight or flight response. So you have the fight response, you have all this adrenaline, and you can really, it can give you a lot of energy. But for many people, there's also the flight response, or there is the freeze response. Especially nowadays, I think many people experience the freeze response if they have trauma or anxiety. And so if you have this freeze response, then you feel like you can't move at all, you're paralyzed, and you're just a victim of the situation, and you can't really actively control the situation and sort of actively control what you're doing. But of course, if you are energetic, if you don't go into this freeze response, you actually maintain a peaceful mind, and you have all this energy, then you can control what you're doing. You don't feel so so locked into the situation, and that obviously, if you don't feel that you're such a victim of the situation, then obviously the fear can subside, and if you feel that you're in control, yet that you can sort of make your own decisions, then you wouldn't fear the situation in the first place, at least not to the same degree. So therefore, being energetic is very helpful to overcome fear, or to not let fear arise in the first place. And then the next point on the list is somebody who is unmindful and not fully aware, but the Buddha is established in mindfulness. So mindfulness obviously is very, very important. If you're unmindful, then your mind just runs wild, and all kinds of thoughts can come up, and all kinds of defilements come up, and your mind is just controlled by the defilements. So let's say you're out in the forest and you hear some kind of rustling in the leaves, and if your mind is uncontrolled, then immediately your mind brings up all sorts of terrors and dangers, and you think, oh, it might be a tiger, or it might be a poisonous snake, and you look around, it's actually a mouse. I think Ajahn Brahm once told this story when Ajahn Brahm was a younger monk. He lived in Thailand in a forest, Kuti, and he was meditating there. And he was meditating out in the jungle in when it was dark, and he was trying to practice and calm his mind. And he heard this rustling in the leaves, and he was sure that it must be a tiger, and he was sure that he was about to die. And then when he turned around, it was in fact actually a mouse. So our mind can play all sorts of tricks on us, and turn the tiniest thing into a really, really big danger, or a very big threat. So if we are not mindful, all these kinds of perceptions can can come up in our mind and can trigger all this panic response. And if we have mindfulness established, then we can just remain calm. We see it's just a minor rustling in the trees. It might just be the wind. It might just be a mouse. And we can rationally reflect that nowadays there are not that many tigers left anyway, and they're probably not going to come and eat us, especially in those places that we usually practice, which are not the jungle in Thailand. And even in the jungle in Thailand, there are very, very, very few tigers left. It's just the mind playing tricks on us because we are not mindful. We don't properly watch our thoughts. And then the next point on the list is being unconcentrated and with straying minds, but I am possessed of concentration. So this is a similar point. Obviously, when you have concentration, when the mind is focused on with single pointed attention on your meditation subject, then those thoughts wouldn't intrude. All these feelings of fear, all these feelings of terror and anxiety wouldn't intrude because you're so focused on your concentration object, on your meditation object, that the fear can't even invade your mind. So if you have strong samadhi, that will also be one of the causes that will not let fear arise. And then the last point on the list is the following. I consider thus: whenever recluses or Brahmins devoid of wisdom, drivelers, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, then owing to the defect of their being devoid of wisdom and drivelers, these good recluses and Brahmins evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I do not resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest devoid of wisdom, a driveler. I am possessed of wisdom. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones possessed of wisdom. Seeing in myself this possession of wisdom, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. So, the last point here on the list is the practice of wisdom. So obviously, wisdom is also a very important quality in Buddhism. And if we have wisdom, then again, this is something that helps us control our mind. This is something that helps us not get overpowered by fear. For example, in the example that we had just now about the tiger, if we have wisdom, we know that there's no tiger around. We know that there's no danger around. So we don't have to follow our random thoughts and get into panic mode because we know there is no real danger there. It's just our mind playing tricks on us. And we also have the wisdom that it is worth keeping on practicing. It's worth letting go of all these things, and it's worth not running away. So sometimes when we go into retreat, go into seclusion, and our mind plays all these tricks on us, and we have all this fear coming up, then it can be easy for us to decide, oh, we're not ready, or we should interrupt the meditation, or we should leave the retreat and go back to whatever ordinary life we normally have. Or we should give in to the fear, and we should open our eyes and check if there really is no tiger. So when we have wisdom, we know it's just our mind playing tricks on us, and we can let all that go. And we know even if there is a tiger, and even if the tiger comes and eats us, still it's worth practicing. And we are creating wholesome states. And if the tiger eats us, then, well, we're just going to die and be reborn somewhere else. And since we have made a lot of good karma by practicing, that will be a good rebirth. And so we don't really have to worry about it that much. So that was the last point on the list. So I think this list is quite interesting. It gives us a lot of pointers where we can that we can look at. If we experience a lot of fear and dread, we can see if there are any of these points on the list that are prevalent in our minds that we can work with and that we can improve on or try to let go, so that fear and dread wouldn't arise that much, or can be diminished at least a little bit as we diminish all these hindrances that are spoken about here in this list. And there's quite a bit of this sutta left. I actually thought that we could maybe go through the entire sutta today, but probably we won't be able to do that. So I think we are going to stop here and finish the rest of the sutta next week. And I see that quite a few people have left comments and questions in the live chat. So I'm going to have a look at that and see if I can answer any of the questions. Okay, so hello everyone. Nice to see so many people checking in. And Anagarika Sunya says that she is not too bad. That's very good to hear, and I hope you recover very soon. Okay. So there is a question here, but I don't think it relates to the sutta. And the question is, what is the real name Lord Buddha Gautama Samana Sama Sambuddha follow? So his real name, well, Gautama is his real name. And the commentaries say that his first name was Siddhartha, but we don't really find that in the suttas. So if you want to trust the commentaries, then that is also his name. And Anagarika Sunya has a question, and she says, how would noble ones be interpreted here? The Bodhisattva was not even a stream enterer before his enlightenment, I think. Yeah, that is a very interesting turn of phrase, I think. And I also wondered about that. So because I think what she refers to is when the Buddha says, I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones with bodily conduct purified, or with whatever, livelihood purified, and all the other things in the list purified. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how we are supposed to interpret this. As I mentioned last time, the Pali word for noble ones here is Arya Savaka, and that can either mean a noble one, so somebody who is a stream enterer or higher, or it can mean a disciple of the noble one, so somebody who is practicing in the way of the noble one, somebody who is following the practices that other noble beings have already practiced. So I think it's probably more likely in this sense that the Buddha, even though he's not a Buddha yet, so he doesn't really know the Eightfold Path yet, so he's just on the way to discovering the Eightfold Path. Still, there are obviously other teachings around him. There are people who teach about what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. There was already an idea of the law of karma. There was already an idea of sila, ethical conduct, and so on in the general population in India, and also among the Samana movements, so the movements of wanderers and recluses and ascetics in India. So probably what he was referring to is that he was trying to live a good life, to purify his conduct and to make good karma, and that he was practicing in the way that noble beings would practice. So rather than translating this as noble ones, it might actually be better to translate this as disciple of the noble ones, maybe. Even though here he calls himself not a noble disciple, but a noble one. So it's kind of difficult to sort of actually pin this down. But yeah, clearly the Buddha wasn't a noble one at this point. So I'm not sure. It's kind of a little bit maybe tricky. I don't know. Okay, and then there's fingerprint, and fingerprint says, until people understand that the Buddha overcame the primal brain identification as self, me, mine, they will be swept away by the senses. The fear of death of body is the biggest. So, yeah, I think in Buddhism, we wouldn't say that this is a brain identification of self, me, and mine. It's the mind identifies this, but the mind is not the same as the brain. But certainly we can be swept away by the senses as long as we have the sense of identification. And fear of death of the body is the biggest, well, it is one of the biggest. So it may be the biggest until we reach the stage of non-return. At the stage of non-return, obviously, we already have overcome the attachment to the body. But at this point, we are still attached to the mind, the mental khandhas. So at that point, fear of death of the body is no longer the biggest. So we still have identifications to self that are not tied up with the body. But generally, for most people that are not anagamis yet, probably fear of death of the body is definitely the biggest. And then Pia and Indira also have a question. And they say, fear is one of the factors that put us off the path. Why is fear not much discussed in other sutta texts? This sutta is an exception compared to greed, hatred, ignorance. We always talk about these three, but not much about fear. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, this is basically what I also said in the beginning. It's very interesting that it's not included in the 5 hindrances. It's not included in the 3 evil roots, greed, hatred, and delusion. So I also think that, especially in modern times, fear is so prevalent in our modern societies. They're very fear-based and fear-driven. And the more we follow a modern lifestyle where we just run after sensual pleasures, the more anxiety actually grows in us, because our lives become so hollow and because we don't really have genuine connections with other people. So our lives seem to become quite meaningless. And so there's a lot of anxiety because we don't really understand why we are on this earth, why we are living, what is the meaning of life, and so on. And we're just running after money, but money doesn't make us happy, and we don't really have another solution to finding happiness. So we just keep on endlessly running after money and just being more and more restless and more anxious also. So fear grows and grows, especially because of the restlessness and because we lose basically sight of what is really important in our life. And yeah, it's very interesting that it's not talked about that much in the suttas compared to other hindrances. I'm not quite sure why. It's possible that our modern society is quite unusual in the way that we are so driven by fear, whereas in the Buddha's time, maybe they weren't that much driven by fear. Maybe they were more driven by greed and hate. But I mean, definitely the Buddha did recognize that fear was one of the main problems on the path. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given this sutta, and otherwise he wouldn't have talked about old age, sickness, and death, because these are very, very fearful experiences in the life of any kind of being, in any kind of time, whether that is in modern times or in the Buddha's time or any other time. All beings eventually have to age, eventually have to die, and have to undergo sickness. So this is very painful, and therefore, because it is painful, it evokes a lot of fear. So it's not that the Buddha didn't talk about it at all. He did talk about it. It's just that he didn't focus on it that much. And my assumption is that because maybe it wasn't one of the main problems that people had back then. But I think in modern times, anxiety is really, really a big problem. And that's also why I want to talk about it today. Okay, there is somebody called Isira, and I think the question again is not at all related to this sutta, so I will just answer it very briefly. And they say they get a lot of pleasure in their meditation. That's great. I can't say if this is a samadhi level or it's just false concentration. Depends on how what kind of practices you're doing. So I think if you have doubts about your meditation, you should really go talk to somebody who is an accomplished practitioner. Since your name sounds very Sri Lankan, I assume that you have access to some kind of teacher in Sri Lanka, there should be a lot of monks and nuns that can help you. So see if you can find a teacher there and talk to them in person. So Anagarika Sunya also says, this sutta presents a very different remedy for fear than the Dajjaka Sutta. Are they complementary perhaps for different audiences? So the Dajjaka Sutta is the sutta about the flagpole, or about the peak of the flagpole. And this is a sutta where the Buddha says, well, if you go to the forest and you experience a lot of fear, then you should recollect the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So his instruction then is to do recollections, the so-called anusatis. We have talked about the 6 anusatis before. These are the recollections of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, sila, generosity, and the devas, so the heavenly beings. And in this sutta, he recommends especially the first 3, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And when we recollect on the good qualities of the Buddha, the good qualities of the Dhamma, and the good qualities of the Sangha, then our mind would be inspired and uplifted, and that would sort of take the fear away, because happiness and inspiration cannot coexist with unwholesome mind states such as fear at the same time in the mind. So it is a very different approach. And in some ways they're complementary, and also people are very different. So people who like devotional practices and who easily get inspired by thinking about the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, especially people who are faith followers, for them doing all these chantings can be very helpful, doing these recollections can be very helpful. People who don't have easy access to those devotional practices might not feel that much inspiration when they recollect the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha. And if they don't feel the inspiration, then they don't feel all these happy, pleasurable feelings. And then it's not that easy to abandon fear that way. Also, it abandons fear momentarily, but it doesn't really see the root cause of the fear. And if we don't really see the root cause of the fear, then we can't develop wisdom and let it go. So it's kind of a temporary remedy to replace unpleasant feelings with pleasant feelings based on the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. But if you want to really abandon fear in the long run, we have to understand what are the causes, why is the fear arising, and how can we abandon this. And I think for that purpose, it's much better to develop wisdom. And so here, that's why in the Bhayabherava Sutta that we read today, there's a whole list of possible causes that make fear arise. And there's a whole list of possible points that we can work with so that eventually, as we diminish those hindrances in the mind and those blockages in the mind, the fear will eventually also dissolve, because the fear arises from those problems in the mind. So as in the sutta today says, for example, if we have the 5 hindrances present, or if we have a sila that isn't purified, or if we have a very big ego, and so on, then these are possible causes, potential causes for fear to arise. But if we understand this, and if we abandon them, then we can abandon fear for good. So I think it's just a very different level of practice, and one is a little bit more superficial than the other, maybe. So Richard M. says, what meditation practice can be best used to deal with fear? So if the fear is a momentary problem that you really need to abandon on the spot, you can try out as Anagarika Sunya just mentioned, the Dajjaka Sutta, do stuff that inspires you. Think about the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, or any of the other recollections about your own sila, your generosity, or the devas. Try to get up inspiration and replace the bad feeling with a more wholesome, positive feeling. However, if you want to abandon fear for good, then it is really necessary to deal with the root cause of fear, and then those contemplative practices that are suggested in the sutta today are much more useful. So when fear arises, you try to see what is the cause of this fear, what makes me so restless, what makes me so anxious, and see if any of the points that we talked about today might be one of the causes for your fear. Fingerprint says, metta practice is the best remedy for fear. The metta practice can be useful for fear in some way. Metta practice is usually used as the antidote for ill will and hatred. So fear is not only based in ill will and hatred. So metta can be useful, but it might not fully abandon the fear. Fear is also associated a lot with restlessness, for example. For restlessness, the recollection of peace is one of the antidotes. So there are different things that we can practice. Anything that makes the mind calm and peaceful and happy and inspired, uplifted, can be used. Again, however, eventually we need to attack the cause of the fear, and for that we need to develop wisdom and understand why the fear arises. So Pial and Indira have posted a comment. I think there's no question there. And they say, there are these 4 ways of getting off course. Which 4? One goes off course through desire, one goes off course through aversion, one goes off course through delusion, and one goes off course through fear. And this is from the Anguttara Nikaya, it seems. And I think probably their point is just that fear is also mentioned sometimes. So sometimes the Buddha adds fear to the usual list of 3 things: greed, hatred, and delusion, or desire, aversion, and delusion. So yes, fear is sometimes added, but not always. It's not that usual to find fear added, but we have a few instances where fear is in fact added. Also in the Vinaya, fear is quite often added. So I think, yeah, probably the Buddha did recognize that fear was a major hindrance, and sometimes he especially mentioned it, and sometimes he didn't and focused on other things. So we've already talked about this. So thank you for sharing that quote. And that seems to have been the last question for today. So we are going to finish this sutta next week. And for now, I just wish you a good rest of the day. And we will finish as usual with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, have a good rest of the day, have a good rest of the week, and I will see you all next Tuesday.